I want to bring in now Claire Sebastian, who's done extensive reporting, of course, from Russia, joining us from London. So, Claire, when we look at this, Ukraine not commenting on this suspect, the arrest of this Uzbek suspect in Russia, but in terms of the narrative that we are hearing from Moscow, does this ring true to you?
So I think, look, the narrative that this was carried out on orders, according to Russia's investigative committee, by the Ukrainian security services, we do have a source familiar with the operation who told CNN on Tuesday that that was, in fact, the case, that this was an operation carried out by the Ukrainian security services. And we have seen an increase in recent months. This was the fourth such assassination on Russian or Russian-occupied soil carried out, either claimed directly or indirectly by the Ukrainian security services or defense intelligence in the last 2 months. So that does ring true. In terms of the nationality of this being an Uzbek national, according to the Russian Investigative Committee and the FSB, well, look, Russia does rely heavily on the presence of migrant workers, particularly from Central Asia, especially now when the war has caused even greater labor shortages than there were before. And human rights groups have accused Russia in the past of racially profiling, of scapegoating Central Asians. There was a backlash that we saw after Tajik citizens were charged with the Crocus City Hall terror attack, that huge terror attack in Moscow in March. So, of course, that was linked certainly by the US and others to ISIS-K, which is active in that region as well. So there are threads to pull there. I think what does ring true in particular here, Erica, is how this fits into the sort of crisis management playbook that we've seen in Russia. They are clearly trying to appear like they are getting out in front of this. It was a security breach. It was a security failing. So this arrest happening some 24 hours later, just like we saw with those Crocus City Hall attacks in March, fits in with that. We also see deflecting from the Kremlin, saying that this is terrorism from what they call the Kiev regime, that it further justifies what they're calling the special military operation, the full-scale war in Ukraine. And of course, they are distancing Putin from this. He personally has not said anything about this yet, though we watch and wait to see if he mentions it. He's holding his major annual sort of public call-in session tomorrow.
Is there any way we should read this assassination when it comes to the broader context of the war at this point in the war, and especially at this point, broadly globally, as we have Zelensky in Brussels at this point?
So this is clearly coming at a critical juncture in this war for Ukraine. Erica, the clock is ticking down. We're just over a month out from Donald Trump taking office again in the US, which could ring in a really significant policy change. We just heard the president-elect this week saying, for example, that he thinks it was a mistake to give Ukraine permission to fire Western long-range missiles at Russia. So I think what we see from Ukraine at this point, and in a similar vein to what we saw with their incursion into the Kursk region, which is still ongoing, is them trying to seize the, if not initiative, then at least show some leverage in any means possible. That's why we've seen, I think, an increase in these assassinations far from the battlefield concerning military figures or figures connected to the Russian military. These are things that Ukraine can do to show their hand, to show that they still have cards to play as we approach what may be a push from the West and from the new US administration towards negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. Claire, really appreciate it. Thank you. More now on the arrest and the killing of a top Russian general in Moscow. Russian officials say they are holding a 29-year-old Uzbek citizen who they allege was recruited by Ukraine's security service. According to Russia, the suspect planted the bomb that killed Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov and an aide on Tuesday. On Monday, Kirillov was charged in absentia by Ukrainian prosecutors for using banned chemical weapons in Ukraine. Looking ahead, Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to meet soon with European leaders and also the head of NATO in Brussels. The Ukrainian president has said his allies might discuss the possibility of international peacekeeping troops in his country. To dig down a little deeper, Nigel Gould-Davis joins me now. He's a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Good to have you with us. Let's start, first of all, with what we're hearing out of Russia. Ukraine not commenting on this suspect, perhaps not surprising, but this 29-year-old Uzbek, Russia also airing on state TV what they say is a confession. It's not clear whether that video was made under duress. What do you make of just how quickly this has all come about? And by quickly, I mean in terms of speed after the killing and the targeting of this Russian general.
Yes, I mean, the killing itself is a very striking development. It's the most high-profile killing of a senior Russian sort of elite figure since the war began. And I think slightly unusually in this case, the Ukraine Security Service, the SBU, has claimed responsibility for it. As for the rapid detection, well, this did take place in Moscow, which is a highly surveilled place. The Russian Security Service say that they used dash cam footage from a nearby car and mobile phone data to quickly track down who they say is the suspect. I've seen the footage of this alleged perpetrator's alleged confession. It seemed reasonably calm, halting, it has to be said, and heavily accented Russian. But yes, no independent verification that this suspect is indeed responsible for the killing. And we await sort of next developments from what the Russians share, but no independent corroboration at this point.
As you noted, this was the senior-most Russian official known to have been killed since Russia invaded Ukraine nearly 3 years ago. Does it signify to you a change at all in this war?
It's not the first such action of this kind. In the past, certainly the early actions of this kind tended to target senior Russian sort of propagandists and ideologists, if you will. And more recently, there's been a move towards targeting Russian figures directly responsible for the attacks on Ukraine, including in this place the use of chemical weapons by Russia in Ukraine. I think, again, what's most significant about this was that it takes place at an unprecedented level of seniority. And this will deeply disconcert other senior elite, including military figures, that they can, in the capital itself, be killed like this.
Speaking of deeply disconcerting, we have Vladimir Zelensky in Brussels to meet with EU and NATO leaders today. I was struck by comments from Mark Rutte, who said of just this week, warning of threats from Russia, said we're not ready for what's coming our way in the next 4 to 5 years, calling on a need to boost spending. Just how significant do you think this looming threat from Russia is?
It's very significant. Europe's ability to respond depends partly, of course, on the decisions taken by the incoming Trump administration. So the sense in which Europe is looking west as much as it is looking east. At the moment, slowly on the ground, Russia is making, at great cost to itself, it has to be said, gains. It is has a larger economy and just more troops than Ukraine, that it's also course, subjected to nearly all of the destruction of the war. So Ukraine finds itself in a difficult position now, and Europe understands that if there were to be some fundamental strategic failure now, if, despite all the endless promises that Russia must fail, all the photo ops with President Zelensky and so on, if nonetheless, having stacked up all those rhetorical chips on the board, so to speak, Russia were nonetheless to prevail, then Europe would find itself in a profoundly difficult situation, not only strategically on the ground, but with respect to its underlying credibility and authority as well. So Europe is urgently aware of the need to commit a greater share of its own very large economy, has to be said, to supporting Ukraine and defending itself. And Secretary General Rutte has been leading the call for that.
Nigel Gould-Davis, really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.